Welcome to Animal Quest. Today we're walking through 7 fatal snake encounters. From a trainee guide who swung open an equipment shed door without sweeping it with a flashlight first and found an 8-foot black mamba already, waiting to a wildlife photographer who rested his hand on what he thought was a branch, unaware of what it had already done to him. But first, we begin with the story of snake influencer Charlotte Davis, who already kept 40+ snakes illegally, but buying one Gaboon viper changed her life forever. It was the 9th of March, 2022, in a converted 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of a mid-sized American suburb. The building was ordinary from the outside, a walk-up with shared laundry, and a lot that filled predictably at the end of each workday. Neighbors knew Charlotte Davis only as the woman who kept odd hours and ran extension cords through her window unit. Charlotte Davis, 24, had started with a single ball python in 2018. By the time she had built a following in online reptile content, that one snake had grown into a collection of more than 40, spread across 4 rooms. Several species required licensing she lacked. Enclosures stacked too high in what had been a bedroom, and heat lamps hummed at all hours, the air carrying the dry, woody smell of cypress mulch. Her content ran on feeding videos and rescue stories. The audience grew steadily, the collection grew faster, and with it, the pressure to make each new animal more remarkable than the last. Her most recent acquisition was a wild-caught Gaboon viper, bought from a private seller after her regular supplier refused the sale outright, citing the animal's unpredictable temperament. That refusal was not incidental, but when you're invested in something, you see nothing wrong with it. The supplier already understood what the animal was. Charlotte was late to understand, and her interest led her to obtain one another way. The viper arrived weeks later, hand-delivered under a private arrangement rather than any standard shipping route, still stressed from the transfer, and was moved into a converted guest room enclosure not built for its size or defensive capability. Before what happened that afternoon, the facts about the animal in that enclosure. Gaboon vipers carry the longest fangs of any venomous snake alive, close to 2 inches, and deliver one of the largest venom yields by volume of any species on record. The venom acts aggressively on tissue and circulatory function, causing severe local destruction and a sharp blood pressure drop well before it affects consciousness. The species is not aggressive by nature in the wild. It relies on camouflage, holding motionless in leaf litter for hours. Strikes occur almost exclusively when the animal is touched or grabbed at close range. It does not pursue. In an enclosure barely large enough to give it distance from the glass, that proximity was constant. Charlotte was filming a feeding segment that afternoon. The angle she needed required the snake out from the cover it had used since arrival. It had coiled tighter than usual into the far corner, a posture consistent with stress from repeated handling. She reached in to reposition it, working around the tripod outside the glass. Her hand passed inches from its head. The strike caught the back of her hand, and 4-armed Gaboon vipers can deliver more than 1 bite in a single defensive response, and both fangs held long enough to empty a substantial volume of venom. Within a minute, the skin around the bite had begun to swell and darken, tightening against her watch strap. She pulled her arm free and made it to the kitchen counter where she had left her phone. Dialing took several tries. By the time the call connected, her blood pressure had already begun to fall, and the operator noted she was struggling to stay on the line. She gave her address, then her voice dropped out. She was alone, with no one to keep her still or the limb immobilized while she waited. Paramedics reached the building a few moments later and got her to the hospital, but over the hours that followed, the venom drove her blood pressure into a collapse that would not hold and triggered a bleeding disorder that spread faster than it could be reversed. She died from the cascading effects of the envenomation. The outcome already set in motion long before anyone reached her. Animal control seized the remaining collection within the week. Several venomous specimens were relocated to a licensed rescue 3 states away. The city reviewed its exotic pet ordinances briefly before the matter stalled, and the apartment sat empty for months, cords still coiled against the baseboards. I have read a number of cases that turn on a piece of prior refusal, a supplier who said no, a safety standard someone else imposed. And the question I find myself returning to is what separates the cases where refusal holds from the cases where it doesn't. Here, the supplier's refusal didn't hold. The animal arrived through a different channel, and it ended in an empty apartment and a seized collection. Not every snake encounter begins inside a controlled space either. Some begin in a barn, with a rule that existed on paper for 11 years until the morning it finally mattered. It was the 14th of July, 2015, at a small licensed breeding facility built into a converted barn outside a farming town in rural Wisconsin. David Ostrowski had repurposed the old cattle barn years earlier, tearing out the stalls for rows of custom enclosures wired for supplemental heat. Insulated decades ago for livestock, the barn held heat well, and by mid-July, the air ran warm and still, thick with cedar shavings and standing water. David was 51, not impulsive, the kind who replaced equipment before it failed and planned his seasons 2 quarters out. His insurer had recommended a 2-person handling policy for any animal over 12 feet, a standard clause in exotic animal liability packages written after well-publicized incidents elsewhere in the industry. In 11 years of operation, he had never followed it. There had never seemed a reason to. Nothing had gone wrong, and each uneventful year made the policy feel more like a formality for someone less careful than he was. And honestly, a decade of experience is nothing less. If you or I were in this position, we might have done the same thing. That's the part worth sitting with. He had operated the facility alone for more than a decade, building a modest client base among collectors he mostly knew by phone rather than in person. The enclosures were maintained with care. Records were kept in order, logged by hand each evening, before locking up the kind of quiet competence that draws no attention because nothing ever goes wrong long enough for anyone to notice it should. Among his breeding stock was a female reticulated python, just over 17 feet long, one of the largest and most valuable animals on the property. She had occupied the same enclosure for several years, a custom-built unit near the back of the barn with a raised platform and a heat mat set into the floor. David knew her history the way a person knows something worked daily for so long. It stops registering as unusual. Her feeding schedule, her shedding cycle, the corner she favored when the barn ran cold. That familiarity had long since replaced caution with habit. Reticulated pythons are the longest snake species on record, with verified individuals exceeding 20 feet. Large females can weigh over 200 pounds. Not venomous, they kill through constriction, tightening with each exhale their prey takes until circulation fails and the heart stops. In the wild, they are ambush predators, triggered by heat signatures and movement at close range. In captivity, that response does not diminish with familiarity or age. Enclosures used regularly for feeding can become strongly associated with food in the animal's behavior, independent of whether it is actually hungry that day. The enclosure itself carries the association. The snake does not distinguish feeding visits from maintenance visits based on the keeper's intent. David entered the enclosure alone that morning to clean it. It was not a feeding day. He moved past the animal's head toward a water dish in the back corner. The strike, when it came, was consistent with a mistaken feeding response rather than a defensive one. The enclosure and the approach may have been enough to cue it. She hit high on his torso, the first coil around his chest, before he could get a hand free to call out. He got one arm partly under a loop near his shoulder, which likely bought him time, but each exhale gave her the slack to draw tighter, and within a minute, a second coil crossed the first. He reached the enclosure wall and pounded against it, but the barn was empty, and the nearest person was in the farmhouse, 100 yards off. Constriction of that kind does not take long to become fatal cardiac arrest. From restricted circulation, and chest compression can occur within a few minutes once the coils are set. By the time a neighbor arrived for an unrelated delivery an hour later and found the barn door open, there was nothing left to do. His surviving family shut the facility down quietly within a month. Local herpetological groups have cited the case in handling seminars, since not as a story about a dangerous animal, but as a case study in what happens when a rule is ignored long enough to stop feeling like one. 11 years of clean outcomes had turned the 2-person policy into background information. The morning of July 14th turned it back. Some encounters are the accumulation of small decisions made across years. The next one was made in an afternoon, on open water, by a guide who had learned to treat a venomous snake as a photographic asset one time too many. It was the 2nd of June, 2016, on a slow Blackwater River running through a private cypress swamp in the American South. Tannin-stained and opaque, the water was bordered by shifting cypress roots and low-hanging Spanish moss. A small, independently operated guide service ran half-day canoe tours here, promising close views of herons, alligators, and the occasional cottonmouth sunning on fallen logs, just 2 canoes a day, piloted by the same 2 guides who'd worked the river for years. Ava Jones, 33, was a nurse from out of state who had driven south specifically to reach that river. She had spent years on a hospital floor, long rotations, shift work, the particular exhaustion of a job that does not allow for inattention. She had taken the trip alone in the weeks following a divorce, with no particular itinerary beyond a few days, in a region that operated at a different speed than her regular life. Friends had suggested somewhere more structured, a resort, a group tour with a fixed schedule, but she had wanted the opposite of structure that week. She had no specialized wildlife background. She booked the tour the same week she arrived, drawn by a handful of photographs on the operator's website showing sunlit saltwater, and half-submerged alligators. Her guide had run that particular stretch of river for 26 years. He knew where the alligators held in the early heat of the morning and which bends the wading birds returned to each year. He had grown casual about proximity to basking snakes over the course of those years, positioning canoes close enough for clear photographs, treating the encounters as something the tours were built around. It was a practice he had repeated without serious consequence, often enough that it had stopped feeling like a variable. I mean, why wouldn't someone trust a guy with 26 years of experience? Obviously, I would have done the same, but sometimes it's just about one bad day. Cottonmouths, also called water moccasins, are pit vipers found throughout the American Southeast. Adults typically reach between 2 and 4 feet in length. They are common in and around water, frequently found coiled on logs, low branches, and exposed banks during warmer months. Field research does not support the widely held belief that they are unusually aggressive most encounters end with the animal freezing, displaying the white interior of its open mouth as a warning, or retreating into the water. A cottonmouth with its path of retreat fully blocked, however, does not move toward a perceived threat to escape. It holds a position. If the distance closes further, it strikes. The guide brought the canoe to rest on the water side of the log where the cottonmouth had been sunning, inadvertently cutting off the animal's most direct route back into the river. Ava leaned out over the gunwale to position herself for a photograph. The snake struck toward her forearm. The guide paddled hard for the nearest road access point, roughly a mile and a half downriver. There was no cell signal for most of the return. Ava remained conscious through much of the trip back, the pain and swelling in her arm worsening steadily. Cottonmouth venom degrades tissue and disrupts normal blood clotting, and Ava's body was mounting an unusually severe reaction to it, well beyond what the bite alone would predict. By the time they reached the road crossing, she was showing signs of shock. She was airlifted to a larger hospital, but the rural clinic's limited anti-venom supply had already cost critical time, and the coagulopathy had progressed beyond what treatment could reverse. She died 2 days later of complications, and not from the bite itself. The tour operation lost its insurance within the year and closed without formal announcement. The canoes eventually sold off to a rental outfit 2 counties over. A state wildlife review and an insurance investigation followed, and Ava's family pursued a civil suit against the operator, though no criminal charges were filed. I keep getting stuck on the geometry of that case. The guide had lined up canoes next to logs like that plenty of times before. What all of those years of doing it never taught him, though, was that the same move that got a passenger a better angle was also telling the animal something, and nobody ever thought to ask what. Not every venomous encounter happens near water. The next one happened in open scrub, a surveyor alone in terrain that was outside the range of everything his 16 years of experience had prepared him for, with a rattle warning that the wind took before he could register it. It was the 22nd of September, 2014. Undeveloped pine scrub in the coastal lowlands of the American Southeast sandy soil and /pine, the kind of land developers buy cheap because nothing about it looks usable. A small local surveying firm had been contracted to stake the lots for a residential project. Late September heat still hung in the afternoon air, and Jones Whitfield drew the assignment that day. Jones was 39, with 16 years of professional experience in suburban and semi-rural survey work. He was methodical in a way that had served him consistently, the kind of fieldwork professional whose documentation was accurate and whose reports arrived on time, respected by the firm's clients for exactly that reliability. His background was in subdivision, staking, and utility easements. Work conducted in open terrain with clear sight lines and manageable ground, lots already partially cleared by previous owners or graded flat by earlier construction. This assignment was different. He worked alone with a GPS unit and a stake bag, moving through palmetto scrub where visibility between plants rarely opened beyond 15 feet in any direction, the ground uneven beneath a layer of dry needles and fallen fronds that obscured exactly what sat underfoot. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are the largest rattlesnake species in North America. Adults commonly reach 5 to 6 feet in length and can weigh up to 10 pounds, with some individuals recorded larger, still in undisturbed habitat. Their coloration, dark diamond markings edged in cream against a brown or olive background, blends almost seamlessly with dry palmetto litter and pine straw, making a coiled animal nearly invisible even at a distance of a few feet. They rely on stillness and camouflage within palmetto litter and dry scrub vegetation, frequently sheltering near gopher, tortoise burrows. They do not excavate themselves, but use extensively for cover and thermoregulation, particularly during the transitional temperatures of early fall. They are not territorial in the deliberate sense that word implies. For mammals, they do not patrol or defend a fixed boundary. But a rattlesnake startled at close range near its only available shelter is often unwilling to abandon the site, choosing instead to hold position and rely on the rattle as a warning before committing to a strike. The rattle itself is a segmented structure of dried keratin, capable of producing a buzz audible for a considerable distance under still conditions. In In dense scrub with wind moving through the surrounding fronds, however, that same sound can be masked by ambient noise before it reaches a person at close range. The warning exists. The terrain determines whether it lands. Jones stepped to within 2 feet of a burrow entrance to plant a stake, his attention on the GPS reading rather than the ground directly ahead. The rattle sounded. The wind moving steadily through the surrounding palmetto covered it. He continued forward. The snake struck from ground level, catching his lower leg just above his boot line. He was alone, more than a mile from his truck, in terrain without cell coverage. He covered some of the distance back on foot before the envenomation's systemic effects, swelling, dropping blood pressure, and mounting weakness made it impossible to continue. He was found roughly 2 hours after the strike by a coworker who grew concerned when Jones missed a scheduled check-in and reached a hospital alive, but died 3 days later from complications despite treatment. The development company delayed the project by a full season and brought in a wildlife consultant to survey the remaining lots before resuming a response that applied to that property and that contractor, and extended no further. Jones Whitfield was not outside the norms of how that job was typically done. He was simply at the outer edge of his professional experience, working in terrain that gave no visible indication of what it contained, with a warning that the environment absorbed before it could reach him. Some animals give a warning that circumstances prevent you from hearing. The next case involves a species that gives none at all, and a trainee who opened a shed door in the dark without checking what had moved inside it during the day. It was the 5th of August, 2018. A small, private safari lodge on the edge of a southern African game reserve, modest grounds, a generator housing, and equipment sheds sitting past the reach of the perimeter lights. It was the dry winter season when nights turned sharply cold, and cold nights had a way of pushing displaced animals toward whatever shelter they could find. Miguel Reyes, 28, was 2 months into a trainee guide position, still learning the operational rhythms that experienced staff move through without conscious effort, which radio channel to use for which task, how far the generator noise carried at night, which paths flooded first when the rains eventually returned. Miguel had come to the position after years of moving between outdoor labor jobs across 3 countries: ranch work, seasonal construction, a stint on a fishing crew, the kind of working history built from availability and willingness rather than credential. He was well liked among the permanent staff, physically capable and reliable in the tasks he'd already been shown. He was quick to learn tasks and slower to internalize the reasons behind them, a distinction that rarely mattered until the exact moment it did. Among the unwritten protocols at the lodge, things that experienced staff did reflexively after years in that environment, was a simple rule. After dark, any enclosed structure on the property was checked with a flashlight before entry, the beams swept low along the floor and corners before a person's body committed to the doorway. It was not posted on a wall. It did not appear in a written induction document. It was the kind of knowledge that transfers through observation and repetition, both of which require time that 2 months does not reliably provide. That evening, Miguel was sent alone to retrieve tools from the supply shed at the ground's far end. The sun had gone down. He opened the shed door and stepped inside without checking it first. Like I said before, sometimes you didn't do anything wrong, but one mistake still takes it all. Yeah, he didn't check it that day, but the result could have gone either way. He always checked every other day, just not that one. And that one mistake took it all. Black mambas are among the fastest moving snakes in the world over short distances, capable of reaching speeds approaching 12 miles per hour across open ground. Adults regularly exceed 8 feet in length, with some individuals reported near 14. Their coloration ranges from olive to gunmetal gray, not black. The name refers instead to the ink-dark interior of the mouth, displayed as a warning when the animal feels threatened. They are, by documented field observation, shy animals that actively seek to avoid contact with humans when escape routes exist. That behavior changes sharply when the animal is cornered in an enclosed space, a shed, a narrow passage, a room with a single entry point where the only available exit is blocked by the perceived threat. In those conditions, a black mamba will strike multiple times in rapid succession. The venom acts on the nervous system and, without antivenom intervention, progresses to respiratory failure. The interval between a full envenomation and incapacitation is short. A mamba had moved into the shed sometime during the day, likely following rodent activity into the interior. It had positioned itself behind a stack of storage bins near the back wall. Miguel's body in the doorway blocked its only exit. It struck toward the disturbance at the entrance 3 times in quick succession, catching his lower leg and hand as he tried to back out. He made it through the doorway and got roughly 20 feet before his legs began to go, the venom already acting on the nerves controlling muscle control. He shouted for help, and a staff member nearby heard him and radioed for the truck kept for medical runs. Like most lodges in the region, the property kept no antivenom on site, following standard regional guidance that favors rapid evacuation to a stocked clinic over on-site storage, given the cost, cold chain requirements, and short shelf life involved. By the time the truck reached him, Miguel was having difficulty breathing on his own. By the halfway point of the drive, he had lost the ability to breathe unassisted, and the staff member with him could not maintain it manually for the remaining distance. Miguel received treatment within 20 minutes of the encounter, faster than the response time in most documented cases in the region, aided by the lodge's proximity to the road. It was not enough. He died before morning of respiratory failure without regaining consciousness after the drive. The lodge revised its after-dark entry protocol within the month and shortened its evacuation window further still. A second vehicle kept fueled and staffed for medical runs, and a direct radio line to the regional clinic to alert them before a patient was even on the road. That change applied to that property, not extended to the broader network of lodges in the region. I keep returning to the timeline. The protocol gap and the evacuation window were two separate failures, and in isolation, either one might have been survivable. Together, they weren't. The rule existed. The nearest stock was still a drive away. 2 months of experience was not enough time to absorb either of those facts into practice. Not every encounter happens in the dark. The next case unfolds in full daylight. On land, a person had walked for 6 years, but beside a log pile that had become something else entirely in the days before she arrived. It was the 11th of April, 2020. Family-run rubber plantation in Southeast Asia, tucked into a valley where morning mist lingered late, leaving the ground soft and the trees still dripping. For years, the plantation had quietly supplemented its income with informal guided walks, no tickets, no licensing, just guests who found their way there by word of mouth. Priya Nair was 30 years old, and she knew the plantation the way a person knows something they have lived alongside since childhood. The drainage patterns after heavy rain, the birds that returned to specific trees each season, the way the afternoon light shifted across the eastern plot as the sun moved past the ridgeline. She had led walks there for 6 years without serious incident, guiding small groups along the same network of paths her family had maintained for 2 generations. This was not just some work for her. This was her generational heritage. She was not a credentialed wildlife guide and never described herself that way. What she had was practical knowledge accumulated over years of close observation, and guests consistently noted the confidence with which she moved through the plantation and identified what they were seeing. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes in the world, with verified individuals exceeding 18 feet in length and average weights that can approach 15 pounds in mature specimens. Their diet consists almost entirely of other snakes, a specialization that has shaped their behavior around territory and cover in ways distinct from most other venomous species in the region. They are the only snake species known to construct an actual nest structure, a mound of accumulated leaf litter, typically built over 1 to 2 days, that the female builds and actively guards through the incubation period, which generally lasts around 2 months. During this phase, the female's behavioral threshold shifts substantially from her usual reclusive tendencies. Approaches that would ordinarily produce a retreat instead produce defense. A nesting king cobra holds its position, rises to a height of several feet by lifting the forward third of its body off the ground, and commits to a strike rather than withdrawing, particularly when a perceived threat moves toward the nest site rather than away from it. The venom targets the nervous system, producing progressive paralysis. A large king cobra delivers, per bite, a venom volume capable of killing an elephant, though the mechanism of death in a human is respiratory failure rather than any direct cardiac effect. Survival depends almost entirely on access to the appropriate antivenom and the speed at which it is administered. Priya had not known a female had nested in a fallen log pile just off the marked walking path, an area the group had passed dozens of times before without incident. The nest had been constructed recently within days, based on its stage of completion, well after Priya's last close look at that section of trail. When a guest stepped off the path toward the log pile for a photograph, drawn by a patch of unusual color half hidden in the leaves, the cobra reared from concealment behind the mound. Priya moved between the tourist and the snake to redirect the group away from the site, a reflexive positioning she had likely made without conscious thought. The animal was already committed to defense. It struck as she turned, catching her upper thigh. She was able to walk, with help from 2 of the guests, back to the plantation's vehicle, roughly 10 minutes away over uneven ground. But within that short walk, the venom's effect on her nervous system had already begun to show. Her speech slowed, and she had trouble keeping her balance without support. The nearest rural clinic was roughly 20 minutes away by the plantation's own vehicle, and did not stock the appropriate antivenom for king cobra envenomation. By the time that was confirmed and the group had been redirected toward the facility equipped to treat the bite, more than an hour further down the same unpaved road, Priya's breathing had become shallow and labored. She lost consciousness before the vehicle reached the second clinic and did not regain it. She died of respiratory failure before treatment could be administered. Local authorities used the case to push for a district-level requirement that all guided nature walk operators maintain a documented evacuation plan, reliable radio or satellite contact with the nearest equipped hospital, and basic venomous snake awareness training for guides, a modest regional measure that did not extend beyond that administrative area. 6 years without incident had given him a pretty solid picture of the land where the risks were, what to expect. But the nest hadn't been there when that picture was last updated. It was somewhere that had never mattered before. Nothing in the walk's recent history indicated it as a site worth monitoring more closely. The cobra had selected it independently in the days before the walk. Some species nest and wait for the threat to come to them. The next case involves an animal that holds completely still in plain sight, and a photographer who touched one without ever knowing what he was reaching for. It was the 30th of October, 2013, dry acacia woodland bordering a small private wildlife concession in eastern Africa. The dry season had stripped the ground to bare red soil, leaving the acacia canopy as the only real shade for miles. Late morning light hit at a flat angle, flattening branches and shadow into a single plane. And in that kind of light, a coiled snake and a tangle of bark can look exactly the same. Anton Kessler, 35, had been working as a freelance wildlife photographer for 4 years, moving through sub-Saharan habitats on a budget that required independent access arrangements rather than the overhead of established tour operators. For that week, he had hired a single local tracker, paid daily in cash, an arrangement that gave him scheduling flexibility and cost him a layer of field knowledge he did not know he was missing. Anton had a working habit the tracker had flagged more than once. He approached still, camouflaged animals closer than the situation warranted, calibrating proximity to what the lens required rather than what the terrain recommended. The observation had been communicated, the practice had not changed. Boomslangs are rear-fanged tree snakes native to sub-Saharan Africa, typically reaching 3 to 5 feet in length. Their coloration, greens, browns, and irregular mottled patterns that vary between individuals integrates with foliage and branch texture in a way that makes identification unreliable in canopy conditions without deliberate close examination. Because their venom-delivering fangs are positioned toward the rear of the jaw rather than the front, envenomation requires more sustained contact than a glancing strike produces. The venom is a potent hemotoxin. It disrupts the blood's ability to clot, causing progressive internal and external hemorrhaging. The defining characteristic of boomslang envenomation from a response standpoint is the delay. Symptoms frequently do not appear for 6 to 24 hours after the bite. That interval has led documented victims to underestimate the severity of the initial contact, continuing normal activity and deferring medical evaluation until the coagulopathy has advanced significantly. Anton was working a low fork in an acacia, sweat already soaking through his shirt in the midday heat, stabilizing his camera against what he had assessed as a branch in the fork to hold the frame steady for a stationary subject further along the canopy. He rested his hand directly on a boomslang that had been holding motionless in that fork. The contact was brief. The snake bit in defense, then released. Anton determined the injury was from rough bark and continued working through the afternoon, returning to camp at the end of the day with what he understood to be a superficial scratch on his hand. You'd have thought the same thing, probably. A scratch is a scratch. Until it isn't. Symptoms appeared several hours after he returned to camp that evening, bleeding from minor abrasions that should have clotted, swelling in the hand, the beginning of a coagulopathy that had been developing since the afternoon. The nearest clinic capable of correctly identifying and properly treating the bite was more than 2 hours away by unpaved road. Boomslang-specific antivenom was not stocked at any medical facility within practical reach of the concession. By the time the severity was clear, the transport had been arranged, and the road had been covered in the dark, the hemorrhagic process had advanced beyond what the receiving facility could reverse. Anton Kessler died early the following morning. The concession owner implemented a requirement for future bookings. Trackers were to carry a written reference card identifying local venomous species and their concealment patterns. The change applied to that property alone and was never adopted anywhere else. I have returned to this case more than most. Not because the mechanism was unusual. Delayed effect envenomation from rear-fanged species in remote areas without appropriate antivenom access produces this sequence with some regularity in the literature. What I find myself dwelling on is the day itself, the hours between the bite and the symptoms. Anton worked through the afternoon light in the acacia woodland, the camera work continuing, the camp approached in the fading day, the hand that had rested on a branch. And then the drive in the dark toward a clinic that could not help him with the specific problem that had been progressing inside him since the afternoon. The boomslang responded to being touched the way its biology required it to. The delay did the rest.